Hi guys, at the end of your chapter there are a couple of strategies on classroom behavior management, and this lecture focuses on those strategies that increase desirable behavior. So if you guys have a behavior in the classroom that a student is not engaging in but you want them to engage in more, so a good appropriate behavior, this lecture will provide you guys with some strategies to increase those behaviors. We're going to first talk about positive and negative reinforcement, and then we're going to talk about some reinforcers, and then we're going to talk about shaping and wrap it up with contingency contracts. I love this quote by Skinner. It says, "The way positive reinforcement is carried out is more important than the amount." And so I want you guys to remember this quote, especially when you think about reinforcement and you're in the educational setting. You can hand out stars and extra credit points and M&Ms and all that all day long, but you're not going to actually increase a desirable behavior unless you use positive reinforcement in the correct way. So using it in the correct way is more important than the amount that you use it. Okay, so let's talk about reinforcement. I'm going to give you guys a pretty technical definition, and we're going to go through it piece by piece. So when you see this, don't be alarmed. We're going to get through it. So reinforcement, our technical definition, is the process by which a stimulus change that is contingent on a response increases the future probability of that response. And you guys can see certain words underlined. So we're going to go through each of those words and talk about what this definition actually means. So with process, we mean that this is the whole process of the person engaging in a response, them getting a consequence, and the future probability of that response increasing. A lot of people get mixed up the words reinforcement and reinforcer. Reinforcer is the reinforcing stimulus, but reinforcement is this whole process. We talk about a stimulus change. So you guys will see the process by which a stimulus change that is contingent on a response. So the person engages in a response and there's some stimulus change in the environment. And this means that something gets added in the environment or something gets removed. And this is where our positive and negative come in with regards to positive or negative reinforcement. Contingent on. You guys will hear me say contingency or contingent on a lot throughout my lectures. Just in general, we're talking about behavior management. And this means that the stimulus change reliably follows the response and doesn't occur at other times. So we talk about a contingency. That's an if-then relationship. So if this behavior occurs, then this happens in the environment. And that consequence doesn't happen at other times. It happens only after the behavior occurs. So you get this kind of cause and effect, this if-then relationship between a behavior occurring and a consequence in the environment. We talk about responses. Remember that we reinforce responses, not people. So you hear teachers talking about, oh yeah, I'm going to reinforce Sarah. Well, you don't reinforce people. You reinforce a behavior that a person engages in. So keep that in mind. And then the last aspect of reinforcement, the key aspect, is that it's going to increase the future probability of the response. So the behavior or similar behavior, if it is reinforcement, it should occur again in the future. So if you just have an example of that one instance, you actually don't know if that's reinforcement or not. If the behavior increases in the future, yes, it's reinforcement. If it doesn't, then it's not reinforcement. So we are always looking on the effects of behavior. And you guys are going to hear me say that again as well. We're always looking at the effect on behavior. If the behavior increases in the future, it's reinforcement. If it doesn't, then it's not reinforcement. So keep that in mind. Okay, so an example of reinforcement. We have a response, the child tantrums at bedtime, and the parent gives the child attention. That's your consequence. And then our outcome is, in the future, the child engages in tantruming behavior at bedtime to get attention. So we have a response from the child, and then we have a stimulus change in the environment, or the consequence. And the consequence is contingent on the response. And in the future probability of behavior is increasing. So this hits every single aspect of our definition of reinforcement. So this would be considered an example of reinforcement. Okay, so I'm going to give you guys some examples, and you guys are welcome to pause this video, kind of think about them, and I would encourage you guys to do that. And when you guys see these examples, first thing you want to do is pick out the behavior and then make sure that the future probability of the behavior is increasing. And remember, we're looking at the effects on behavior. So first one, Nathan finishes all his vegetables at dinner one night and his parents give him ice cream for dessert. The next night, Nathan does not finish all of his vegetables. So pick out our behavior. It's finishing his vegetables, and the behavior is not increasing. So the first night he finishes all of his vegetables, but the next night he doesn't. So remember, reinforcement, the future probability of the behavior increases. So this would not be considered reinforcement. Second, every time Nathan tells his mom that she looks good today, his mom gives him smiles, hugs, and kisses. And as a result, Nathan becomes more likely to tell his mom that she looks good. So his behavior is telling his mom that she looks good, and it's becoming more likely to tell his mom that she looks good, so the behavior is increasing. So this would be an example of reinforcement. One day, little Susie finishes all her work at school and gets a gold star for the day. So I want you guys to think about this one. Remember, we're looking at the effects on behavior. So the behavior has to increase in the future. Right now, we don't know if it's going to increase or not. She finishes all her work one day. If she comes back the next day and finishes her work, then yes, it would be reinforcement. But she might come back the next day and not finish all of her work, and then it wouldn't be reinforcement. So at this point, remember, one instance doesn't tell you if it's reinforcement or not. It has to increase in the future. And lastly, every evening Nathan has gotten ready for bed. His parents put on a DVD that Nathan can watch until his bedtime at 8. As a result, Nathan always gets ready for bed with lightning speed. So his behavior is getting ready for bed, and it's increasing because he's getting ready for bed with quicker and quicker. And so, yes, this would be an example of reinforcement. Okay, so let's look at positive versus negative reinforcement. And if you guys remember from our definition, a response occurs and then there's a stimulus change in the environment, and where either a stimulus is added or a stimulus is removed. And that's where your positive or negative comes into play. So with positive reinforcement, a response occurs, a stimulus is presented, so something gets added. So the stimulus change is that something gets added in the environment, and therefore the response increases. Negative reinforcement, something aversive is in effect, the response occurs, and the stimulus change is that something gets removed from the environment. So the aversive stimulus gets removed, and therefore the response increases. So, we've already given an example of positive reinforcement, but I can give you guys another one. Let's see. We'll go back to little Susie. So little Susie finishes all her work. She gets a gold star. The stimulus is presented. And if she comes back the next day and finishes her work, then it would be reinforcement. I don't know. Say you have a kid that is completing his math problems, and you give him praise. He comes back the next day and completes his math problems. Positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement, an example of that is, like I said, something aversive is in effect, response occurs, and that aversive stimulus gets removed, and therefore your response increases. If you guys have a headache is aversive, so your response might be taking aspirin. When you take aspirin, your headache gets removed, and therefore in the future you're more likely to take aspirin when you have a headache or when you feel like you're going to have a headache. When you guys wake up in the morning, you guys might hear your alarm going off. Well, that's aversive, so your response could be hitting the snooze button. Hitting the snooze button removes the alarm because the alarm goes off, and therefore next time the alarm goes off, you're more likely to press the snooze button. It removes the alarm, and some people end up pressing the snooze button, 5, 10 times, things like that. That's an example of negative reinforcement. If you're in a lecture hall or in a class, it's really cold, that's aversive, so you might put on a jacket. The coldness gets removed, and therefore the next time you're in a cold environment, you put on a jacket and you're not cold anymore. All right, so with both positive and negative reinforcement, remember they're both reinforcement, in which a response occurs in both of these, and the future probability of that response increases. It just depends on if it's positive, it increases because a stimulus that they like is presented. If it's negative, it increases because an aversive stimulus that they don't like is removed. But regardless, they're both reinforcement, so they're both going to increase the future probability of the response. Okay, in determining whether the behavior or the process is positive or negative reinforcement, 3 steps to remember. First of all, and similar to our steps that we talked about last time, first of all, what's the behavior? So the first thing you want to do is identify the behavior. And then I actually go down here and I look at the desired change of the behavior as a result of the consequence. So I look at, is the behavior increasing or decreasing? If it's increasing, it's going to be reinforcement. If it's decreasing, it's going to be punishment or something else. And then after the behavior occurs, what is the nature of the stimulus? Does something get added or does something get removed? If something got added, it's positive reinforcement. If something got removed, then it's negative reinforcement. So let's practice these. We have a child start screaming in a boring store. The parent offers to go for ice cream as soon as they're done. Next time they go to the store, the child screams again and the parent offers ice cream. So I'm sure you guys have probably seen this. First of all, pick out your child's behavior. So the child's behavior is screaming. Next, is it increasing or decreasing? So this is step 2. And we see that the next time they go to the store, the child screams again. So our behavior is increasing. So we know that it's reinforcement. And then we look at, after the child is screaming, is something being added or removed? And we show that after the child screams, they get offered ice cream. So something gets added. So this would be positive reinforcement. So go through each of these steps, figure out what your behavior is. Is it increasing or decreasing? If it's increasing, it's got to be reinforcement. And then what happens after the behavior occurs? So with your consequences, something being added or being removed. If it's being added, it's going to be positive reinforcement. If it's being removed, it's going to be negative reinforcement. Okay, so part 2. A child starts screaming in a boring store. The parent offers to go for ice cream as soon as they're done. Next time they go to the store, the child screams again and the parent offers ice cream. Okay, so now we're going to look at it from the parent's side. So what is the parent's behavior? So the parent's behavior is offering ice cream. And is it increasing or decreasing? And we see that when the child screams again, the parent offers ice cream again. So it's increasing. So we know that we got the parent's behavior of offering ice cream. It's increasing, so it's reinforcement. So now we have to figure out, after the child offers ice cream, after the parent offers ice cream, what's the consequence? So is something being added or removed? And after the parent offers ice cream, the child stops crying, so something's being removed. So in this example, it would be negative reinforcement. And you oftentimes see these two kind of play in, and oftentimes it depends on whose perspective you're looking at. In this situation, from the child's perspective, it's positive reinforcement. They scream, they get ice cream. From the parent's viewpoint, they offer ice cream and the child stops screaming, negative reinforcement. And that's why oftentimes there's a lot of behavior problems in grocery stores and things like that, because the child engages in problem behavior. The parents offer ice cream or cookies because the child stops crying, and it's hard to have this screaming child in a grocery store, but it kind of creates this downward cycle in a sense. Okay, last, testing yourself. Johnny's been crying during school. His parents decide that they're not going to let him watch TV when he gets home if he cries in school that day. Johnny no longer cries in school. So let's look at our behavior. It's Johnny crying in school, and we're going to figure out, is it increasing or decreasing? And Johnny no longer cries in school, so our behavior is decreasing. So in this example, it's not increasing, so it's not reinforcement. All right. So I want you guys to tell me positive or negative reinforcement. Johnny puts his quarter in the vending machine and gets a piece of candy. Next time he sees a vending machine, he puts a quarter in it. So behavior is putting a quarter in the vending machine. It's increasing, so we know it's reinforcement. And after he puts his candy in, or his quarter in, you have to figure out, is something getting added or removed? And in this example, something gets added, so he gets a piece of candy. So this would be positive reinforcement. Bob does the dishes every night in order to stop his mom's nagging. So our behavior is doing the dishes. He does it every night, so it's increasing, so we know it's reinforcement. Now we have to figure out, after he does the dishes, does something get added or removed? And after he does them, his mom stops nagging him. So his mom was in a burst of stimulus, the nagging. He does the dishes, that nagging gets removed, so negative reinforcement. Natalie can get up from the dinner table when she eats 2 pieces of broccoli. Natalie starts eating her 2 pieces of broccoli really fast. So I want you guys to pause, go through your 3 steps, figure out what the behavior is. Is it increasing or decreasing? And if it's increasing, you know it's reinforcement. And then figure out, after the behavior occurs, is something getting added or removed? And this would be example of negative reinforcement. Number 4, you take an aspirin and your headache goes away. When you have a headache in the future, you take aspirin. So we had this example before, but it's also an example of negative reinforcement. All right. Okay. Nathan tells a joke and all his friends laugh. Nathan goes home that day to find another joke to tell his friends. This would be an example of positive reinforcement. All right, guys, let's talk about examples of positive and negative reinforcers in the classroom. And so positive reinforcers in the classroom are typically praise, stickers, privileges, tokens, if you're going to use that token economy, attention, good grades, food, smiles, positive feedback, things like that. And when you're providing a positive reinforcer and you're implementing reinforcement, you want to make sure that you reinforce, you're kind of descriptive in your reinforcer. So if you're using praise, make sure that you are praising the child and praising the behavior that they're engaging in. Oh, I love how you're completing your math problems. I love how you're doing your work. I love how you're working hard. Things like that. And you want to do it as immediate as possible. We talked about that earlier. Negative reinforcers, remember, these are threats that people engage in a behavior to remove. And so a lot of times, removing bad grades, if they have a bad grade, they'll study to remove the bad grade. Taking away a threat. So one big thing that teachers typically do is they will stare at a kid or give them a glare or something like that until they do their work. Well, the kid's doing their work to remove the glare or to remove the threat. And so I really want to urge you guys to try to use positive reinforcement as much as possible in your classroom as opposed to negative reinforcement. You want the kid to complete his work and to behave appropriately because they get something that they like, or they get a smile from you, or they get praise from you. That establishes really positive relationships between you and the learner. You don't want the kid to start completing their work to stop your nagging or to stop your threat. That does not establish that positive relationship between you and the students. Negative reinforcement is very common in the school district. It's used a lot. It's used a lot in parenting. It's used a lot just in the world in general. So I really would urge you guys to try to stop using that negative reinforcement and switch to positive reinforcement. Instead of glaring at a kid till he does his homework or starts doing his work, don't look at him, and then when he starts to do his work, come give him praise. Tell him you love how he's working, that he's doing his problems, everything like that. So really kind of switch your tactics and try to use that positive reinforcement as much as possible. All right, so I wanted to expand a little bit more on positive reinforcement and the specific reinforcer. So reinforcers are, positive reinforcers are defined by their effects on behavior. So you know you have a reinforcer if it increases the future probability of the behavior. And this can be different for each person. So money is a huge positive reinforcer. Typically, people work for money. Praise, I work for praise. I like it when people praise me. Some people might not care. I like good grades. I would work for that. Some people could care less about grades. I love chocolate, so I would work for M&Ms, where some kids would not care to work for M&Ms. So you have to figure out what is a reinforcer for your student, for your individual student. And you have to use the reinforcer effectively. This goes back to our Skinner quote, where it doesn't matter how many times you give the reinforcer, just that you use it effectively. Timing is important, so right when the behavior occurs, you want to provide the reinforcer. And the contingency is important. Remember, we talked about contingencies earlier. That's that if-then relationship. So if the behavior occurs, then they get the reinforcer. So, and that's that relationship. So you shouldn't be giving the reinforcer out at other times, only after the behavior has occurred. And that's when you get that if-then relationship. And the person has to want the item. And this can change throughout the day. So, you know, they might want food right before lunch because they're hungry, whereas after lunch they might not be so inclined to work for food because they're full. So our wants change throughout the day and across days, so that's what makes it challenging to identify a reinforcer. One reinforcer that you can use are tokens, and these are really, really common in the clinical setting as well as in the school district. So this is when you have some type of symbolic representation of a reinforcer. And after they get, so a token would be a reinforcer, and after they get so many tokens, then they can exchange that in for what we call a backup reinforcer. So this is an example of a token system in more of the clinical setting. So the child chooses what they're working for. So this is a backup reinforcer, and it can be one of these. Usually you will use pictures if you have younger children or things like that. So they might be working for a walk. So you put the walk up here so they can see it, and then they have to earn 5 tokens to get their walk. You have to be really careful with reinforcers that they don't become satiated. So token systems are a really good way to do that, and that the person doesn't get a walk every single time, and that walk doesn't take out so much instructional time. You can just give a token, and after 5 tokens, then they get their walk. And the number of tokens depends on the learner. So it could be 5 tokens, it could be 10, anything like that. And you can also make token boards. You can individualize them. So this kid really likes cars. We've done superheroes and princesses for girls and things like that. Now in the school system, you might not actually be able to do these token boards, especially if you have older kids. But they might like money. So play cash is a really great thing. So maybe you have little Johnny who sometimes completes his work and sometimes doesn't. Maybe he gets $100 every time he completes his work. And then when he gets $1,000, he gets a big backup reinforcer, something that he wants. So you can do it that way. The downside to using token economies in the school district is that a lot of times there's not a budget for it. So whatever your backup reinforcer is, whatever the kid actually wants, a lot of times you have to end up paying for that by yourself. So just keep that in mind. If your principal and your school supports it and they have the money and the budget for it, then awesome. But if not, realize you might have to actually fork over that cost on your own. Okay, so let's talk about shaping. We have shaping and then we're talking about contingency contracts, and that's it. So with shaping, if you have a behavior that you want to occur in a kid, a desirable behavior, but that behavior is not occurring at all or is occurring really, really infrequently, then you might want to think about using shaping. So shaping is when you use selective reinforcement of behaviors that come closer and closer to the targeted response. So this is kind of, you have this main goal of what you want the child to do, but you break it up into sections and you kind of shape up the behavior. For example, a lot of my training was in kind of basic research, so sometimes I like to give basic research examples and then take it and apply it. So if you think of a rat in a Skinner box, you have to shape up him pressing the lever to get food. And so if you put the rat in the Skinner box at the beginning, you're going to have to wait a long time for him to actually go up to the lever and press the lever to get food. And so you can shape up the response. So our main target is him pressing the lever. But when you use shaping, you're going to reinforce successive approximations to that target behavior. So you might reinforce him running close to the lever. And once he's running close to the lever, you might reinforce him rearing up. So rats just rear up in general. And once he's reliably doing that, so once he's going over to the side of the cage where the lever's at and rearing up, you might reinforce him putting his paws on the lever. And after he's putting his paws on the lever, then you might reinforce him pushing the lever down. And so if you would have waited for him to push the lever down, you would have been waiting for a really long time. but you took that behavior of pressing the lever, you made steps, and you reinforced those steps that get closer and closer to the target response, and eventually you'll have your target response. Okay, so how to use shaping. Oh, sorry. First, you want to identify your desired behavior, and then identify the student's present level of performance. So how close is he to that desired behavior? Then you want to list the steps that take the student from the present level to the desired level, and you want to make those steps progressively more demanding. And then you tell the student that after they accomplish one step, step 1, they get the reinforcer. And then once the student has mastered step 1, then they have to master step 2 to get the reinforcer, and then step 3 and step 4, and so on. I like to think of shaping as a funnel. So this first step is going to be really broad, and then you're going to get closer and closer and closer with each step to your target behavior. So think of it as that funnel. Here's an example. So John never does his math homework. You would like to have him complete his homework on a daily basis, and you realize that if you wait for him to do this on his own, it might not happen. So if you just wait for John to finish his math homework on his own and reinforce that, then you're probably going to be waiting a really, really long time. So you decide to use shaping, break it up into steps, so that way you can kind of shape up him doing his math homework. So you might break it down like this. First, John just writes his name at the top of his worksheet, and he gets his reinforcer. After he is reliably doing that, then he has to complete 1 problem of his choice. After he's reliably doing that, he has to complete 5 problems of his choice. And after he's reliably doing that, he has to complete the odd or the even numbers. And then he has to complete all the problems except 1, and then he completes all of his problems. And so hopefully after shaping, he is now completing his math homework. Now I have over here this kind of art easel, art paint, and I want you guys to realize that shaping is an art, and this might sound really easy, but when you lay out your steps or your kind of tasks analysis, you have to make sure that each step is not too easy or too difficult, or your system can kind of break down. So if you find that a step is too difficult, you have to go back and break that step down even further. So keep that in mind. How many steps you need and how far apart they are depends on your learner and your learner's ability. Here's another example. So Sam has difficulty kicking the kickball in PE. You decide to use shaping. So first of all, Sam will stand in place and kick a stationary ball. Then Sam will stand in place and firmly kick a slow approaching ball rolled by the teacher. And then Sam will run to an approaching ball rolled by a teacher. And then Sam will run to an approaching ball rolled by another student and kick it. And then Sam will run to an approaching ball that has a spin to it and kick it. So you're shaping up these responses that occur really, really infrequently or don't occur at all. Okay, last thing we're going to talk about is the contingency contracts. So these are written documents in which you identify a target behavior and arrange consequences contingent on a specific level of the target behavior during a specific part of time. So here's an example of a behavior contract. So basically you want to have the student's name on there, you want to have the behavior expectations and the consequences. Now you can use contingency contracts to decrease undesirable behavior and increase desirable behavior. And so I have them on this lecture when we're talking about increasing desirable behavior because I really hope you use them to mostly focus on increasing desirable behavior because we always want to use positive reinforcement as opposed to negative reinforcement, or as opposed to some type of punishment or anything like that. So let me give you guys an example. Here is an example of a blank contingency contract. So you put the student's name, the date of the contract. You always want to have the purpose. You want to put the behaviors you're going to increase and the behaviors you're going to decrease. The rewards for desired behavior. So everything is basically laid out for the kid. If they engage in the desired behavior, they know what they get. If they engage in the undesirable behavior, they know their consequences. Ways to help the person succeed. And then you want the child to sign it and you want you to sign it. And you guys can pause this. This is an actual example of one filled out. So you guys can look and kind of read that, the purpose of it, what they're increasing, what they're decreasing, the rewards, the consequences, and ways to help Gary succeed. So kind of the intervention. These help best when the child has some input in making the contract. So if you just make the contract and present it to the child, it can be effective, but it's more effective if the child helps create this contract. And then you want to make sure that you both sign it and you both follow through with it as well. Alright guys, so that's all. We talked about a lot. We talked about positive and negative reinforcement. We talked about reinforcers, token economies. We talked about how to do shaping. And then we talked about those contingency contracts that you can use. If you have any questions about what we talked about, please email me. And that's it guys. Thanks.